The master bedroom of the Palm Jumeirah villa sat in darkness except for the glow of a smartphone screen, its blue light illuminating Fatima Al-Kaabi's face as she scrolled through messages that destroyed her marriage and sealed a woman's fate. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Dubai's skyline glittered like scattered diamonds across velvet night, a monument to wealth and ambition. Inside, a 34-year-old Emirati woman sat on Italian silk sheets worth more than most people's monthly salaries, reading text exchanges between her husband and their Filipina housemaid that progressed from inappropriate to intimate to explicit over the course of 18 months. "I love you more than you know," her husband had written to the maid at 2:17 a.m. while lying in bed beside Fatima. "She doesn't understand me like you do. You're the only real thing in my life." The next message was worse. "I'm leaving her. I don't care about the consequences. We'll figure it out together. You and me and our future." Fatima's hands trembled as she read further, discovering not just emotional betrayal but physical affair conducted in her own home, in guest rooms and pool house and even the kitchen when Fatima was away visiting family. Most devastating of all was the pregnancy test photo from 3 days ago, sent by the maid with message, "It's positive. We're going to be parents." On November 3, 2022 at 3:47 a.m., while her husband slept obliviously beside her and their 3 children dreamed in rooms down the hall, Fatima Al-Kaabi made a decision that would transform from grief into rage into murder. By sunrise, the Filipina maid who'd worked in their household for 2 years would be dead. By the following week, Fatima would be arrested for one of the most sensational murder cases in recent Dubai history. And by the trial's conclusion 6 months later, the case would expose the toxic intersection of class privilege, cultural honor codes, and the expendability of domestic workers whose lives end when they threaten families that employ them. This isn't just a story about a scorned wife's revenge. It's about a system where wealthy families view domestic workers as property rather than people, where pregnancy becomes a death sentence for women whose only crime was being vulnerable to men who controlled their visas and their survival, and where justice depends entirely on whether your life matters to people with power. Rosa Santiago was 27 years old when she died in a Palm Jumeirah villa that cost more than every house in her Philippine hometown combined. She thought the man who whispered promises of love and marriage was her escape from poverty. She didn't know she was walking into a trap set by economics, exploitation, and a wife whose concept of honor required blood. This is the story of how affair between employer and employee became murder when a wife discovered the truth and decided that some betrayals demanded permanent solutions. Rosa Marie Santiago was born in 1995 in Batangas City, Philippines, in a coastal province known for beautiful beaches that tourists photographed and local poverty that tourists ignored. Her family's house sat in a barangay where homes crowded together like refugees seeking shelter, where typhoons regularly destroyed what little people had accumulated, and where opportunities for advancement were as rare as the justice that might follow when domestic workers died in foreign countries. Her father, Ernesto, worked as a tricycle driver, earning 300 to 500 pesos daily depending on passenger volume, weather, and mechanical failures that his aging vehicle experienced with increasing frequency. Her mother, Maricel, sold fish at the public market, standing for 12 hours daily in heat and humidity that made the seafood spoil quickly and her profits evaporate just as fast. Rosa was the eldest of 4 children, which meant she became secondary parent around age 8 when her mother's working hours made childcare impossible and her father's income made hiring help laughable. She finished high school in 2013 despite walking 7 kilometers each direction because bus fare meant siblings eating less. She was intelligent enough to earn a scholarship to a local technical college, pragmatic enough to choose a degree in hotel management because the Philippine service industry offered the closest thing to reliable employment, and desperate enough to understand that staying in Batangas meant repeating her parents' cycle of poverty indefinitely. But even with her degree completed in 2016, the best local jobs offered 8,000 pesos monthly, roughly $140. Wages that barely covered personal survival, much less supporting parents and siblings who depended on her. The mathematics were brutal: work domestically and remain poor forever, or work overseas as a domestic helper and potentially transform family circumstances through remittances. In 2019, at 24 years old, Rosa enrolled in the mandatory training program required for domestic workers. 6 weeks of instruction covering cooking, cleaning, childcare, and most importantly, the psychology of servitude required to survive in Gulf households. The trainers, themselves former domestic workers, provided warnings wrapped in euphemisms. Some employers may have expectations beyond your official duties. Male household members may show inappropriate interest. Your visa depends on employer satisfaction, so maintaining good relationships is essential for employment security. The message was clear. Sexual harassment was so common it required acknowledgement, but naming it explicitly would mean admitting the industry's complicity in trafficking women into situations where exploitation was built into the employment structure. Rosa told herself she'd be careful. She'd maintain boundaries. She'd work her 2-year contract, save 80% of her salary, return home with 150,000 pesos that could start a small business or buy property that might finally break poverty's grip on her family. The plan was achievable as long as she didn't get pregnant, didn't fall in love, didn't trust that wealthy employers saw her as human rather than commodity they'd purchased for 1,200 dirhams monthly. She arrived in Dubai on March 15, 2020, her arrival coinciding with COVID-19 pandemic that was transforming global movement. The timing actually worked in her favor, with international borders closing and domestic worker supply disrupted. The few workers who'd arrived before restrictions were in high demand. The recruitment agency placed her within 3 days with the Al-Kaabi family, a prominent Emirati household looking for experienced help. The Palm Jumeirah villa was beyond anything Rosa had imagined. The artificial island, shaped like a palm tree and visible from space, represented Dubai's ambition made concrete. Villa 23 occupied a prime frond location, a 12,000 square foot residence worth approximately 35 million dirhams. 7 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, private beach access, infinity pool, home theater, gym, and staff quarters that housed 4 domestic workers, Rosa and 3 other Filipinas who'd been with the family for varying lengths of time. The Al-Kaabi family consisted of Khalid, 37, who worked in his family's real estate development company in a position that required minimal actual labor, his wife Fatima, 34, from an equally prominent family whose marriage had been strategically arranged to consolidate business interests, and their 3 children, daughters aged 9 and 6, and a son aged 4. To complete the household, Khalid's mother visited frequently, his siblings occasionally stayed in guest rooms, and a rotating cast of relatives and business associates appeared for dinners and gatherings that required extensive staff preparation. Rosa's duties were comprehensive. Wake at 5:30 a.m. to prepare breakfast, clean the villa's primary living areas, do laundry for the entire family, assist with children's needs when they weren't in school, serve meals, clean up afterward, and remain available until dismissed around 10 p.m. Her official day off was Friday, though she often worked partially even then because household needs didn't pause for staff rest. The salary was 1,200 dirhams monthly, roughly $325, from which she could save approximately 800 dirhams after purchasing phone credits, toiletries, and occasional personal items. Over 2 years, she'd save roughly 20,000 dirhams, about 270,000 pesos, enough to buy a small lot in Batangas or start a sari-sari store that might generate family income indefinitely. The dream was modest but achievable. Rosa sent her first remittance in April 2020. 8,000 pesos that allowed her family to finally fix their leaking roof. She sent 10,000 pesos in May for her youngest sister's high school tuition. By June, she was establishing the pattern that would define the next 2 years. Work exhausting hours, tolerate condescension from employers who treated her as invisible furniture, and save aggressively toward the escape that would justify every indignity. For the first 9 months, Rosa maintained perfect professional boundaries. She addressed Khalid as Sir and Fatima as Madam, spoke only when necessary, and made herself as inconspicuous as possible. She'd heard stories from other Filipino workers about male employers who viewed domestic staff as sexually available, and she was determined not to become another statistic. But predators don't require cooperation. They simply wait for opportunity and vulnerability to align, then deploy tactics refined through generations of wealthy men exploiting women whose economic desperation makes them pliable. The shift began in January 2021, approximately 10 months after Rosa's arrival. COVID-19 restrictions had confined families to their homes more than usual, creating tensions in marriages already strained by proximity and familiarity. Khalid and Fatima's relationship had been arranged for business reasons rather than romantic love, and 2 decades of cohabitation had eroded whatever affection might have existed initially. They argued frequently, about money despite having millions, about his family's interference in their household, about her spending on luxury goods, about his long hours supposedly at the office though Fatima suspected other activities. The marriage was performance maintained for social appearances and children's stability, not genuine partnership between equals who chose each other. Into this dysfunction, Rosa represented something Khalid found increasingly appealing. Youth, beauty unspoiled by cosmetic procedures, and most importantly, gratitude. She appreciated the salary he provided, the accommodation, the ability to support her family. Unlike his wife who treated wealth as birthright and found constant reasons for dissatisfaction, Rosa seemed grateful for circumstances that were actually exploitative but appeared generous when compared to her previous poverty. The pursuit began with manufactured kindness. Khalid started appearing during Rosa's work hours, initiating conversations that seemed friendly rather than predatory. He'd ask about her family in the Philippines, express concern about whether she was adjusting well to Dubai, comment that she seemed too educated and refined for housework. The attention felt flattering because Rosa had been invisible for so long that being seen felt like recognition rather than assessment of her availability for exploitation. Then came the gifts. Extra money added to her salary with vague explanations about bonuses for excellent work. A new smartphone to make calling family easier, significantly better than the budget device she'd brought from Philippines. Expensive chocolates and perfumes that cost more than her monthly salary, presented casually as if his gift-giving was motivated by benevolence rather than calculation. "You work so hard," Khalid told her during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. "Much harder than Fatima ever has. She's never done a day of real work in her life. She doesn't understand what it means to struggle, to sacrifice for family. But you do. That makes you special." The comparisons were strategic, positioning himself as trapped in marriage to a woman who didn't appreciate him, while Rosa represented authenticity and genuine connection. He was performing the oldest script in the predator's playbook, the wealthy man trapped by circumstances who finds true understanding with the beautiful young woman whose economic vulnerability makes her accessible in ways that women of his own class would never be. By March 2021, the relationship had progressed to regular private conversations during late evenings when Fatima was asleep or occupied with her social media and television programs. Khalid would summon Rosa to his study, ostensibly to discuss household matters, but the conversations would drift into personal territory. His frustrations with his marriage, his dreams of living differently, his growing feelings for her that he claimed to be fighting unsuccessfully. "I know this is inappropriate," he'd say with manufactured vulnerability. "You work for me. I'm married. This shouldn't be happening. But I can't help how I feel. You've brought something into my life that's been missing for years. Purpose, connection, something real." Rosa recognized the manipulation intellectually but found herself responding emotionally anyway. She was 26 years old, had never had a serious relationship because poverty made romance a luxury she couldn't afford, and desperately wanted to believe that someone could love her for herself rather than viewing her as labor to be extracted. Khalid represented not just romantic possibility but financial security beyond anything she'd imagined. He spoke about taking care of her permanently, supporting her family forever, giving her a life where she'd never have to clean someone else's house again. The first kiss happened in April 2021, during late evening conversation in the study. Khalid had positioned it perfectly, after particularly emotional discussion where he'd shared carefully edited vulnerabilities while listening to her talk about her difficult childhood with apparent empathy. When he leaned forward and pressed his lips against hers, Rosa froze momentarily before responding, her better judgment overwhelmed by loneliness and the desperate hope that this powerful man's interest might be her escape route. "I love you," Khalid whispered afterward, the 3 words deployed with perfect timing. "I know it's complicated, but I love you. We'll figure this out together. I promise I'll take care of you." The physical relationship that followed over the next 18 months was conducted with meticulous secrecy. They used guest rooms when Fatima was away visiting family or friends. They met in the pool house during late evenings when household staff had retired. They even used the kitchen during early morning hours before other staff woke. Khalid's sense of entitlement so complete that he'd take Rosa on the same counters where meals for his family were prepared. Rosa convinced herself this was relationship rather than exploitation. Khalid told her repeatedly that he was planning to divorce Fatima, that he'd marry Rosa properly once circumstances allowed, that he didn't care about the social consequences of choosing her over his arranged wife. The promises were specific enough to feel credible. He'd buy her a villa, support her family permanently, give her children that she could raise without financial worry, transform her from domestic worker into legitimate wife who'd finally achieved the security she'd chased her entire life. What Rosa didn't understand was that for men like Khalid, domestic workers weren't potential wives but temporary entertainment. The promises of marriage and future together were tactical fictions designed to maintain her compliance and prevent her from making demands that might complicate the arrangement. He had no intention of leaving his wife. The social cost would be catastrophic, the financial implications of divorce would be massive, and most importantly, replacing Rosa with a different domestic worker would be far easier than divorcing his wife of 15 years. By September 2022, Rosa had been conducting the affair for 18 months. She'd isolated herself from other Filipino workers who might judge her choices or warn her about patterns they'd witnessed before. She'd convinced herself that the lack of progress on Khalid's promised divorce was due to timing rather than deception. She'd invested so completely in the fantasy of their future together that acknowledging reality would mean accepting that she traded her dignity for promises that were never going to be fulfilled. Then she missed her period. The pregnancy test she took on October 28, 2022, returned positive. And everything that had seemed like romance revealed itself as exploitation that was about to turn fatal when pregnancy transformed her from convenient to catastrophic. Rosa discovered she was pregnant on October 28, 2022, her period 2 weeks late and her body showing symptoms she'd been too frightened to acknowledge. Nausea that wasn't related to food, exhaustion despite adequate sleep, breast tenderness that made wearing her uniform uncomfortable. She purchased a pregnancy test from a pharmacy in Dubai Marina during her day off, taking it in the public bathroom of a shopping mall because she couldn't risk anyone in the household discovering the evidence. The test was positive. She was approximately 6 weeks pregnant with Khalid's child, a complication that transformed their relationship from secret affair into existential threat to everything Khalid valued. His marriage, his reputation, his standing in a conservative Emirati society where illegitimate children were scandal and relationships with domestic workers were shameful regardless of how common such exploitation actually was. For a week, Rosa carried the secret while calculating her options. She could get an abortion. UAE law technically prohibited it except in medical emergencies, but she'd heard about underground clinics that served women with money and desperation. The procedure would cost approximately 8,000 dirhams, money she'd saved over 2 years that was meant to be sent home to build her family's future, not to eliminate evidence of her affair with her employer. Or she could tell Khalid and hope that the baby would finally force him to fulfill the promises he'd been making for 18 months. Pregnancy changed the calculation. This wasn't abstract future anymore but concrete life forming inside her. A child that was half hers and deserved better than being eliminated because its father valued convenience over responsibility. On November 1, 2022, Rosa made her decision. She would tell Khalid about the pregnancy and trust that their relationship, which he'd claimed was the most real thing in his life, would inspire him to finally leave his wife and acknowledge their child publicly. She chose late evening when Fatima was attending a social event at a friend's villa. The timing felt strategic. Privacy without Fatima's presence. Opportunity to have serious conversation without risk of immediate discovery. Rosa found Khalid in his study, working on his laptop though his attention was primarily on his phone where he was scrolling through social media. "I need to talk to you about something important," Rosa said from the doorway, her voice trembling despite attempts at composure. "Come in," Khalid replied, his tone suggesting he expected this to be routine household matter requiring quick resolution. She entered and closed the door, her heart racing. "I'm pregnant. About 6 weeks. The baby is yours. There's been no one else." The silence that followed stretched for approximately 15 seconds, though it felt infinite. Rosa watched Khalid's expression cycle through shock, calculation, irritation, and finally something cold that made every survival instinct scream warnings. "You're certain?" His voice was carefully controlled. "I've taken 3 tests, all positive." "Khalid, I know this is complicated, but you've been promising for over a year that you'd leave Fatima. Maybe this is the push you needed. We can finally be together properly. You can acknowledge our child. We can." "Stop," he interrupted, his tone hardening. "Rosa, we need to be very clear about what this relationship is. What we have is enjoyable, but it was never going to lead to marriage or legitimate children. I'm married to Fatima. We have 3 children together. I can't destroy my family, my reputation, my social standing for this." "You said you loved me?" Rosa replied, hearing desperation in her own voice. "You said I was the only real thing in your life. You promised we'd have a future together. Was all of that lies?" "It was what you needed to hear," Khalid said with brutal honesty. "Rosa, you're a housemaid. You're Filipina. You work for me. There was never going to be marriage. You must have understood that on some level." "I'm pregnant with your child," she said, her voice breaking. "That makes me more than just your employee. This baby deserves a father who acknowledges it." "The baby deserves not to exist," Khalid replied coldly. "I'll pay for the procedure. I'll give you bonus money afterward, maybe 15,000 dirhams so you can return to Philippines with savings. But this pregnancy cannot continue. What if I refuse? What if I keep the baby and tell people it's yours?" The threat was desperate and foolish, revealing her complete lack of understanding about how power actually functioned in her situation. Khalid's expression shifted to something genuinely dangerous. "Then you'll regret it," he said quietly. "I control your visa. I can have you deported with criminal accusations that make you unemployable anywhere. Your family will lose every peso you've sent them. I'll pursue legal claims that the money was stolen from my household. Your siblings' education will end. Your parents will return to worse poverty than they experienced before. Is that what you want for your family?" "You wouldn't," Rosa whispered, though she knew he absolutely would. "Test me and find out," Khalid replied. "You have 1 week to schedule the abortion. If you refuse, you'll face consequences that extend far beyond you personally." But Rosa didn't have a week. Because Fatima Al-Kaabi, who'd been suspicious of her husband's behavior for months, had installed monitoring software on his devices that sent copies of all messages to her own phone. And when Rosa sent Khalid the pregnancy test photo on November 2nd with message, "I can't do the abortion. I'm keeping our baby," Fatima received that message simultaneously. The affair that Khalid thought he'd been conducting secretly had been fully visible to his wife for months. She'd read every love letter, seen every explicit photo, tracked every promise he'd made to the woman cleaning her home and sleeping with her husband. Fatima had tolerated the affair with barely contained rage, waiting for the moment when she could destroy both her husband and his mistress completely. The pregnancy provided that moment. Because in Fatima's worldview shaped by conservative cultural values and personal humiliation, Rosa Santiago wasn't a vulnerable young woman being exploited by a powerful man. She was a homewrecker who'd seduced her husband and was now trying to destroy her family. And homewreckers deserved punishment that transcended mercy. Fatima Al-Kaabi discovered her husband's affair through digital surveillance she'd initiated 6 months earlier, when his behavior had become suspiciously attentive toward the new housemaid. As a woman raised in Dubai's wealthy circles, Fatima understood that powerful men viewed domestic workers as sexually available, and she'd witnessed enough similar situations among her social network to recognize the warning signs. Khalid praising Rosa's work excessively, appearing during her shifts more frequently, giving gifts that exceeded appropriate employer generosity. The monitoring software she'd installed on his phone in May 2022 without his knowledge sent copies of all messages, photos, and call logs directly to Fatima's devices. For 6 months, she'd watched the affair develop in real time. The early flirtation, the first declarations of love, the progression to physical relationship, and most painfully, Khalid's promises to leave his wife for a domestic worker young enough to be his daughter. Fatima hadn't intervened immediately because rage had refined itself into something more calculated. She wanted comprehensive evidence before confronting the situation. She wanted to understand the full scope of the betrayal before deciding how to destroy both participants. Most importantly, she wanted the perfect moment, the point where her retaliation would be most devastating. The pregnancy notification provided that moment. When Rosa sent Khalid the message, "I can't do the abortion. I'm keeping our baby," on November 2nd, 2022, Fatima read it simultaneously on her own device. The words detonated something primal in her psyche. Not just anger about infidelity, but fury that this foreign worker presumed she could carry her husband's child, that pregnancy might legitimize the affair, that Rosa believed she could demand marriage and transform from housemaid into wife. In Fatima's worldview, deeply influenced by concepts of honor and family standing that transcend economic class, Rosa had committed multiple unforgivable offenses. Seducing a married man, having sexual relations outside marriage, getting pregnant with illegitimate child, and worst of all, threatening to expose the situation publicly by keeping the baby. Such violations demanded punishment that went beyond firing or deportation. They demanded blood. Fatima spent November 2nd and 3rd planning with meticulous precision. She researched how domestic workers died in UAE households. The statistics were grimmer than she'd anticipated. Approximately 40 domestic workers died annually in Dubai alone from various causes. Many ruled accidental or suicide with minimal investigation because foreign workers' lives received less scrutiny than citizens' lives. Falls from buildings during window cleaning, poisoning from chemical exposure, drownings in pools, suicides by hanging, all common enough that one more death would barely register. She considered her options carefully. Poisoning could be detected in autopsy. Pushing Rosa from a window might show signs of struggle. But drowning or suffocation could be staged to look like suicide motivated by depression about unwanted pregnancy. A narrative that authorities would accept readily because it confirmed existing stereotypes about foreign workers' mental instability. On the evening of November 3rd, Fatima sent Khalid a message saying she was visiting her sister in Sharjah for dinner and wouldn't return until late. This was lie, she had no plans to leave. She wanted Khalid to think he had privacy for one of his encounters with Rosa, wanted both of them relaxed and unsuspecting when she confronted them. At 9:47 p.m., Fatima's hidden cameras in the villa showed exactly what she'd anticipated. Khalid summoning Rosa to one of the guest bedrooms, their embrace and kissing, the casual way he removed her clothing as if she existed solely for his pleasure. Fatima watched it all on her phone with expression of cold fury, recording the encounter for evidence while simultaneously preparing for the confrontation that would follow. At 10:23 p.m., she burst into the guest bedroom with the fury of 15 years of humiliation finding its target. Khalid and Rosa scrambled to separate, their shock and terror evident as Fatima stood in the doorway with her phone recording. "So this is what you've been doing," Fatima said, her voice deadly calm despite the rage underneath. "Fucking the maid. In my house. In my guest room. While your children sleep down the hall." "Fatima, I can explain," Khalid began, reaching for his discarded clothes with desperation that would have been comical if the situation weren't so dangerous. "Explain what? That you're a whore who can't keep his dick in his pants? That you've been screwing domestic staff like some pathetic cliché? I've watched it all, Khalid. I've seen every message, every photo, every disgusting promise you made to this piece of trash." Rosa had wrapped herself in the bedsheet, her terror complete as she understood that the affair she'd thought was secret had been fully visible all along. "Madam, I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to seduce my husband?" Fatima interrupted, her attention shifting to Rosa with concentrated hatred. "You didn't mean to spread your legs for him every chance you got? You didn't mean to get pregnant and think you could trap him into leaving his family? The baby is his," Rosa said desperately, as if pregnancy might provide protection rather than making her more vulnerable. "He promised to take care of us. He said he loved me. He says that to all his whores," Fatima spat. "You actually believed him? You thought a man like Khalid would leave his wife and family for a Filipina maid? You're even stupider than I thought." She turned back to her husband. "Get dressed and get out. Go to a hotel. I'll deal with you later. Right now, I need to handle this situation." "Fatima, what are you going to do?" Khalid asked, genuine fear entering his voice as he recognized something dangerous in his wife's demeanor. "I'm going to have a conversation with the maid," Fatima replied, "about consequences and appropriate behavior. You don't need to be present." "I'm not leaving you alone with her," Khalid said, though his concern seemed motivated more by self-preservation than genuine care for Rosa's well-being. "Then watch," Fatima said coldly. "Watch what happens when foreign workers forget their place and think they can destroy Emirati families." What happened in the next hour would be reconstructed later through forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Fatima's own partial confession. The confrontation escalated from verbal abuse to physical violence as Fatima's rage overwhelmed whatever restraint she'd been maintaining. She attacked Rosa with a fury that 15 years of accumulated humiliation had been building toward, using her hands and whatever objects were available to beat the woman who represented every failure in her marriage, every compromise she'd made, every indignity she'd tolerated. Khalid's role during the violence was ambiguous. He later claimed he tried to stop Fatima, but evidence suggested his intervention was minimal at best. More likely, he stood paralyzed by shock and self-interest, recognizing that his wife was solving a problem he created but hadn't known how to eliminate. By 11:34 p.m. on November 3, 2022, Rosa Santiago was dead. Cause of death would later be determined as blunt force trauma to the head combined with asphyxiation. Fatima had beaten her unconscious, then suffocated her to ensure finality. The 6-week-old fetus she'd been carrying died with her, eliminated before it could complicate the Al-Kaabi family's reputation. Khalid and Fatima then faced the practical problem of disposing of a body in their Palm Jumeirah villa, with 3 sleeping children and 3 other domestic workers in the household. Their solution revealed both their desperation and their confidence that wealth could purchase solutions to even capital crimes. The cover-up began immediately after Rosa Santiago's death. Khalid and Fatima, whose marriage had been strained to the breaking point by his infidelity, suddenly found themselves united by mutual interest in avoiding murder charges. Their wealth, connections, and understanding of how Dubai's justice system actually functioned gave them advantages that Rosa's family would never possess. Khalid's first phone call was to his cousin, a lieutenant in Dubai police whose career had been advanced through family connections and who owed multiple favors to the Al-Kaabi family. The call, made at 11:52 p.m. on November 3rd, was brief and coded: "Family emergency requiring discretion. Can you come to the villa alone?" The lieutenant arrived within 40 minutes. What he saw in the guest bedroom, Rosa's body, the signs of violent struggle, the terrified couple who'd called him, required a decision between duty and family loyalty. He chose family, understanding that his career advancement depended more on Al-Kaabi favor than on justice for a dead Filipina domestic worker. "This needs to look like suicide," the lieutenant said after assessing the situation. "Depression from unwanted pregnancy. Common situation with foreign workers. Medical examiner will accept it if the scene is staged properly." They worked quickly. Rosa's body was moved to her quarters in the servants' section of the villa. The lieutenant provided instructions based on suicides he'd investigated. They needed to create a hanging scene, using Rosa's own bedsheet, positioning her body to suggest she'd stood on her bed, fashioned a noose, and ended her life while other household members slept. The staging took approximately 2 hours. They cleaned the guest bedroom where the actual murder had occurred, removing any biological evidence. They positioned Rosa's body in her quarters to simulate hanging suicide. They created a suicide note using Rosa's own phone, a brief message typed in English: "I'm so sorry. I made terrible mistake. I can't face the shame. Please forgive me and take care of my family." The note was deliberately vague, not mentioning Khalid or the affair specifically, but implying pregnancy-related distress that would make suicide seem plausible. The lieutenant coached them on what to say during official investigation. Rosa had seemed depressed recently, had been withdrawn, had mentioned feeling homesick. The pregnancy would be discovered during autopsy and presented as explanation for her mental state rather than evidence of the relationship that had actually killed her. By 3:30 a.m. on November 4th, the scene was set. The lieutenant left, promising to ensure the investigation would be handled by officers who understood the importance of discretion. Khalid and Fatima returned to their bedroom and spent the remaining pre-dawn hours in tense silence, each processing their complicity in murder and calculating how to maintain the lie they'd constructed. At 6:15 a.m., another Filipino domestic worker named Carmela discovered Rosa's body during her early morning rounds. Her screams woke the household, triggering the carefully choreographed response Khalid and Fatima had rehearsed. Shock, confusion, grief performed for an audience of traumatized staff and children who just learned that the friendly housemaid had killed herself overnight. Dubai police responded to the emergency call at 6:34 a.m. The investigating officers, subtly directed by the lieutenant cousin to handle the case with minimum scrutiny, conducted perfunctory examination of the scene. The suicide staging was believable enough. Domestic workers' suicides were tragically common, pregnancy explained motive, and the notes seemed authentic to officers who weren't looking closely. The medical examiner's initial assessment supported suicide determination. Death by asphyxiation consistent with hanging, time frame estimated between midnight and 3 a.m., no obvious signs of foul play to superficial examination. The pregnancy was documented, approximately 6 weeks, and noted as probable suicide motive. The bruising on Rosa's body from the beating she'd endured was explained as injuries sustained during the hanging process. By November 5, less than 48 hours after Rosa's death, Dubai police had officially classified the case as suicide motivated by pregnancy-related distress. The investigation was closed. Arrangements were made to transport Rosa's body back to the Philippines. The Al-Kaabi family expressed appropriate sadness about losing a valued employee to tragic mental health crisis. The perfect crime, executed with the efficiency that wealth and connections enable. But two things would unravel the carefully constructed lie. First, Rosa's family in the Philippines refused to accept the suicide narrative. They knew their daughter, knew she wouldn't abandon her responsibilities to the family she'd been supporting, knew something about the story didn't make sense. Second, Carmela, the domestic worker who discovered the body, had heard the confrontation on November 3rd. She'd been awake due to insomnia, had heard shouting from the guest bedroom area, had heard sounds of violence that police never questioned her about because the suicide determination made witness testimony seem irrelevant. Carmela carried that knowledge for 2 weeks, terrified of speaking because she understood what happened to domestic workers who threatened powerful families. But eventually, guilt and fear of divine judgment overcame fear of earthly consequences. On November 18th, she contacted the Philippine embassy and told them what she'd heard. The Philippine embassy received Carmela's testimony on November 18, 2022, 2 weeks after Rosa's death had been ruled suicide and her body had already been transported back to Batangas for burial. Carmela's account was detailed and disturbing. Loud argument between Fatima and Rosa on November 3rd, sounds of violence including screaming and objects breaking, and most significantly, silence after approximately 11:30 p.m. Timing inconsistent with Rosa having hanged herself at the midnight to 3 a.m. timeframe that authorities claimed. Embassy officials faced a dilemma. The case had been officially closed. Rosa was already buried in the Philippines. Reopening investigation meant challenging Dubai police's determination and implicitly accusing a prominent Emirati family of murder. Such accusations required overwhelming evidence because diplomatic relationships and economic interests made alienating wealthy UAE families politically costly. But international pressure was building. Rosa's family had contacted Filipino media, whose coverage of yet another domestic worker dying mysteriously in Dubai was creating public outrage. Human rights organizations were demanding investigation. The Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs, facing domestic criticism about its failure to protect overseas workers, was pressuring the embassy to push harder for answers. On November 22nd, the embassy formally requested that Dubai police reopen the investigation based on witness testimony contradicting the suicide determination. The request triggered bureaucratic resistance. Police don't appreciate having their competence questioned, especially by foreign embassies advocating for dead domestic workers whose lives weren't politically valuable. But the pressure was too sustained to ignore completely. On November 28th, Dubai police assigned senior investigators to review the case. This second investigation, conducted by detectives with no family connections to the Al-Kaabis and no stake in protecting their reputation, began finding cracks in the suicide narrative immediately. Forensic re-examination of Rosa's body, which required exhumation in the Philippines, a process traumatic for her grieving family, revealed injuries inconsistent with suicide by hanging. Bruising patterns on her face, torso, and arms indicated she'd been beaten before death. Fractures to her skull suggested blunt force trauma. The hyoid bone damage was consistent with manual strangulation rather than hanging. Combined, the evidence painted a clear picture. Rosa had been murdered, then staged to look like suicide. Digital forensics provided even more damning evidence. Investigators recovered deleted messages from Rosa's phone showing the affair with Khalid, his promises of marriage, her pregnancy notification, and his demand that she get an abortion. More significantly, they discovered that Fatima's phone had monitoring software that gave her real-time access to all Khalid's communications, proof that she knew about the affair long before the night Rosa died. Security camera footage from the villa's external cameras showed timeline inconsistencies. The lieutenant cousin's vehicle arriving at the villa at 12:30 a.m. on November 4th, timing that made no sense if Rosa had simply committed suicide and Khalid had called police through normal channels. The footage also showed intensive activity in the villa between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. Lights going on and off, movement between sections of the house. Patterns inconsistent with household members simply sleeping through the night unaware that their housemaid had killed herself. Most devastating was Carmela's expanded testimony. Under immunity from immigration consequences, she provided detailed account of what she'd heard. Fatima's voice screaming accusations about the affair, Rosa's pleading, sounds of violence including objects being thrown, and what seemed like physical assault, then suspicious silence. Carmela also testified that the villa had been in chaos on November 4th with extensive cleaning of the guest bedroom, a room that should have been undisturbed if Rosa died in her own quarters as the suicide narrative claimed. The investigation also uncovered the lieutenant cousin's conflict of interest. His relationship to Khalid, his presence at the villa during the critical hours when the body was supposedly discovered, his influence over how the initial investigation was conducted, all suggested corruption rather than coincidence. On December 15, 2022, Dubai police arrested Fatima Al-Kaabi and charged her with premeditated murder. Khalid was arrested simultaneously and charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. The lieutenant cousin was arrested for official corruption and tampering with evidence. The case that authorities had tried to close as routine domestic worker suicide was now an international scandal exposing how wealth and connections had nearly enabled a family to literally get away with murder. The trial began in February 2023 and immediately became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent UAE history. Not because the wealthy committed crimes that happened regularly, but because this case involved an Emirati woman from a prominent family being prosecuted for murdering a foreign domestic worker, a prosecution that Dubai's justice system typically avoided when possible. The prosecution's case was methodical and overwhelming. Forensic evidence proved Rosa had been beaten and murdered rather than having died by suicide. Digital evidence demonstrated Fatima's knowledge of the affair and her months of surveillance. Witness testimony from Carmela established timeline and violent confrontation. The staging of the suicide scene, assisted by the corrupt lieutenant, showed consciousness of guilt and premeditation of the cover-up if not the original murder. Fatima's defense attempted multiple strategies, all ultimately unsuccessful. Initially, they claimed self-defense, that Rosa had attacked Fatima when confronted about the affair, that Fatima had struck Rosa in self-defense, that death was accidental result of lawful protection of herself and her home. This narrative collapsed immediately because Rosa's injuries were far too extensive for defensive response and occurred in guest bedroom rather than any location where Fatima could credibly claim to have been defending herself. The second defense strategy was more culturally resonant but legally problematic. Provocation based on honor violation. The defense argued that discovering Rosa pregnant with Khalid's child constituted extreme provocation that reduced Fatima's culpability. In some legal systems, honor defenses can mitigate murder charges when wives kill mistresses or husbands kill unfaithful wives. But UAE law, despite its conservative cultural context, doesn't provide blanket immunity for honor killings. The defense's third approach was attacking Rosa's character, portraying her as seductress who deliberately targeted Khalid, manipulated him into affair, gotten pregnant intentionally to trap him into marriage. This strategy backfired spectacularly. Evidence showed Khalid had pursued Rosa, that the power differential made genuine consent questionable, that his promises of marriage had manipulated her into relationship she wouldn't have entered if she'd understood it was temporary entertainment for him. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. Rosa Santiago came to Dubai seeking honest employment to support her impoverished family. She was exploited by her employer, sexually manipulated with false promises, and murdered when pregnancy made her inconvenient. Her death was then staged as suicide, with police corruption enabling the cover-up. This case represents everything wrong with how domestic workers are treated, as disposable commodities whose lives can be taken without consequence when they become problematic. The verdict, delivered on May 8, 2023, reflected the strength of evidence and international attention that made acquittal politically impossible. Fatima Al-Kaabi, guilty of second-degree murder, sentenced to 20 years in prison. The court found insufficient evidence of premeditation, planning the murder in advance, but overwhelming evidence of intentional killing during confrontation. Khalid Al-Kaabi, guilty of accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice, sentenced to 10 years in prison for his role in staging the suicide and covering up the murder, though prosecutors couldn't prove he'd participated in the actual killing. The lieutenant cousin, guilty of official corruption, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice, sentenced to 15 years and permanent dismissal from Dubai police. The sentences were unusually harsh by UAE standards for crimes involving domestic workers, reflecting international pressure and prosecutors' determination to demonstrate that even prominent Emirati families couldn't murder with impunity. But for Rosa Santiago's family in Batangas, no sentence restored what they'd lost. Their daughter and sister, who'd worked so hard to improve their circumstances, was dead at 27 with her unborn child. The money she'd sent home over 3 years felt tainted now by knowledge of the exploitation and manipulation that had preceded her murder. The Al-Kaabi family's reputation suffered catastrophic damage. Khalid's real estate company severed his involvement. Fatima's prominent family publicly disowned her to protect their own social standing. The 3 Al-Kaabi children, innocent victims of their parents' crimes, were removed from their custody and placed with relatives while social services evaluated their welfare. The Palm Jumeirah villa where Rosa died was sold at significant loss. Even in Dubai's luxury market, properties associated with murder struggle to find buyers at full value. The proceeds were placed in trust for the 3 children whose parents' imprisonment had destroyed their family structure. Rosa's family in Batangas received compensation from the Al-Kaabis through civil settlement. Approximately 500,000 dirhams, roughly 7 million pesos, enough to transform their economic circumstances but insufficient to fill the void Rosa's death created. Her younger siblings completed their education using the settlement funds, pursuing the futures Rosa had worked and died to make possible. Carmela, the domestic worker whose testimony proved crucial to prosecution, was granted special residency status in UAE as protected witness, though she chose to return to Philippines where she became advocate for domestic workers' rights. "I speak for Rosa and all the women who can't speak anymore," she told media during interview. "I speak so their deaths aren't forgotten and their lives are remembered as valuable." The case became catalyst for modest reforms in how UAE authorities handle domestic worker deaths. New protocols required independent investigation of any domestic worker death before suicide determination could be finalized. Embassy access to workers in distress was theoretically improved. But systemic problems remained. The kafala sponsorship system still gave employers extraordinary control, cultural attitudes still viewed domestic workers as lesser humans, and economic desperation still forced women into situations where exploitation was built into employment structure. International coverage of the case exposed realities that Dubai's tourism marketing carefully concealed. Behind the luxury hotels and shopping malls, behind the world's tallest buildings and artificial islands, hundreds of thousands of migrant workers lived in conditions ranging from exploitation to outright slavery. Rosa's murder was extreme outcome, but the power dynamics that enabled it existed in thousands of households where domestic workers navigated sexual harassment, excessive hours, wage theft, and physical abuse with minimal protection or recourse. Fatima Al-Kaabi serves her sentence in Dubai Women's Prison, where her wealth purchases some comfort but can't eliminate the reality of incarceration. In interviews with journalists, she alternates between justifying her actions. She was trying to destroy my family, and expressing carefully calibrated remorse that seems more about her imprisonment than about Rosa's death. Khalid serves his sentence in Dubai Central Prison, maintaining that he's primary victim of the situation. "I made mistakes," he told a reporter during authorized interview. "But I didn't kill anyone. I'm losing 10 years of my life because my wife couldn't control her emotions and the maid couldn't control her ambitions." The statement reveals persistent belief that Rosa deserved blame for her own murder, that getting pregnant by her employer and hoping for acknowledgement constituted ambition, rather than reasonable expectation that the father of her child might provide support. Rosa Santiago is buried in Batangas City Municipal Cemetery, her grave marked by headstone that her family purchased with compensation money from her murderers. The inscription reads simply, Rosa Marie Santiago, 1995 to 2022. Beloved daughter and sister. She worked so we could live. May God grant her peace she never found on earth. Visitors to the cemetery report that the grave is always well maintained, fresh flowers regularly replaced, rosary beads draped over the headstone. Her mother visits weekly despite arthritis making the journey difficult, praying for her daughter's soul and crying for the grandchild who died before drawing breath. The Palm Jumeirah continues glittering in Dubai's sun, its artificial palm fronds hosting villas worth tens of millions. Tourists photograph the impossible luxury, the triumph of engineering over nature, the monument to wealth so extreme it reshapes geography. But domestic workers in those villas know Rosa's story. They share it in whispered conversations during rare free moments, teaching new arrivals about what happens when you forget your place, when you believe powerful men's promises, when pregnancy transforms you from convenient to catastrophic. The swimming pools still gleam, the marble still shines, the luxury remains perfect. But underneath, in servants' quarters and back hallways and spaces where wealth allows itself to be honest about its cruelty, Rosa Santiago's ghost reminds women that their lives are valuable only until they become inconvenient. And then they're simply erased. Remember her name, Rosa Marie Santiago. She was 27 years old. She was pregnant. She was murdered by her employer's wife for the crime of being exploited by her employer. Subscribe to keep these stories from being buried like the women they're about. Share to reach domestic workers who need to know the truth about Dubai's luxury built on disposable lives. Comment to show that Rosa's death demands more than silence and convenient lies. Your voice keeps her memory alive. Your attention makes the next murder harder to hide. Your refusal to accept the suicide lies forces justice that wealth tries to purchase. She died begging for mercy. We honor her by refusing to let her killer's narrative define her story.